Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I will be providing my book review of the second book in the Star Trek Mission Gamma series, This Gray Spirit by Heather Jarman. This is a follow-up to the first book in the series, Twilight, which I read recently and also reviewed on the channel, and quite enjoyed it quite a lot. And this is also Heather Jarman's debut novel that she wrote. She wrote about a half dozen novels in her career for Star Trek, including the book String Theory Evolution, which is the third book in the String Theory series for Voyager. And I read that book and thought it was fine. It didn't wow me. I didn't love it, but I thought it was a fine read. And this is her debut book, and so I really enjoyed it. I was blown away by how much I enjoyed it. I anticipated the quality of the writing to go down since this was A, her debut, and B, since it was the second book in the series, I didn't think that they'd be able to handle it well, but it's still very enjoyable. So I'll begin with my first thing is the incredible pacing that this book had. It is very amazing how this book is so fast-paced. What Heather Jarman does with the story structure is something that I think should have been done earlier, but didn't really happen as clearly in the last book, where every chapter alternates back and forth between Deep Space Nine and the Mission Gamma series, or Mission Gamma stuff happening in the Gamma Quadrant with the Defiant. And every single chapter is going back and forth, and every chapter ends with something to propel the reader on to the next one. And so there aren't as many chapters in this book. The chapter lengths of Twilight, the first book, were like maybe 7 or 8 pages per chapter, whereas the chapter lengths in this book were closer to 20 pages per chapter. And as a result, you spent more time in a chapter, but then you instantly went back to the other plot line and caught up again. And I highly enjoyed both plot lines very much. The plot line on Deep Space Nine is always more interesting to me naturally than the plot line in the Defiant, because even though I like some of the characters on the Defiant, the natural political storyline happening in Deep Space Nine is what's intriguing to me. But here, Heather Jarman raised the bar with how she wrote the storyline of the Defiant, and it was much more interesting. It reminded me, to be honest, because they're in the Gamma Quadrant, it reminded me very much of a Voyager episode, and I highly enjoyed all the shenanigans and all the repercussions and the explorations. There's some great political discussions in the Defiant as well, and there's also some great thriller aspects to it that I really enjoyed, and some mystery aspects that I really enjoyed reading. And so what makes this book better than Twilight is the fact that it has such a strong B plot with the Defiant, but the A plot is just as if not more strong than the main Deep Space Nine plot of Twilight, because there's so little fluff, things are moving at a rapid pace, and I needed to know what happened with the whole, I don't want to give too much away when I say it, but the whole Federation, that's how I'll say it, Federation plotline, because there are members of the Federation who are starting to join. There are also members who are trying to keep those forces from joining, and then there's also discussions about making a kind of a pact between the Cardassians and the Bajorans, who have been had very tense relations up to this point. And there's also a subplot there with the Andorians, and I naturally do not like the Andorian culture, because it's just not a culture that I really appreciate. I don't like the values of the culture, but Heather Jarman does a very good job with the Andorian culture, and she really nails the character here. And I believe that her handling of the Andorians in this book is why she got the Andor novel that came out later, where she literally wrote a novel about Andor. And so her handling of the Andorians was really impressive here. And I really liked the stuff with Kira in this book. There's a reason, in the last book, you had Elias Vaughn as the main person on the cover. This one, it makes sense why Kira's on the cover. In fact, so far, it's made sense why each character on the covers has been on those covers. It really, they're the central character in each individual story. And Kira really takes center stage here, and her unraveling of the Bajorans and of the Federation and their goals was very interesting. Her understanding of the Cardassians. There's some great political dialogue, much like my favorite novel, Elantris. There's some great political dialogue, but it is not attacking anyone specifically. It is just bringing up themes in Star Trek that might be applicable in real life. And I highly enjoyed that. What I really also like in this book is the storyline with Ezri and Shar, who, when they're on the Defiant, they're really trying to mend a political situation that's not very good among this kind of civil war happening among this alien species. And things often don't go right, and Shar is constantly undermining Ezri because she has a natural goal she's going to, and he wants to be the hero. He wants to go do something bold, do something brash, and save the day. And Ezri's like, no, we got to stay on the straight and narrow path. And he's like, no, I'm going to go wide left and go do something crazy. And he has some great points, but at the same time, so does Ezri. And so there's a very interesting leadership and power dynamic discussion here that I think is really applicable to regular relationships in real life that I thought was really interesting. I really thought it was interesting, the twist that happened in the book. This book had, your mystery level, ooh, that's interesting twist to it that I really enjoyed reading, and I really appreciated it. The problem that this book has that keeps it from getting a perfect score is it does not feel cohesive with Twilight. And Deep Space Nine stories as a whole. And here's what I'll say with that. When you read books like the Fall series, where they were writing them all together, and the authors were talking with each other, sending emails, sending notes back and forth, working off of the same documents. And it seems like they were coordinated, the editors were involved, but the authors themselves were friends, they were connected, they were working together. And in this book, it feels like she knew the basics of what was happening in the previous book and maybe what was happening in the next book, but didn't feel like she had to have so much emotional weight. There wasn't as much referencing the other book. You could start to read this book, and there are little details from the last book you'd miss, but it would not be obvious. If you didn't know this was book 2, you theoretically could jump into it as book 1 of a series, because it does not directly, it does not feel influenced heavily by the ideas of book 1, which is a real shame. And not only that, you'll notice in the acknowledgments that Heather Jarman writes a pretty standard, if not lengthy, acknowledgments section, and not once in those acknowledgments does she reference her fellow authors, like David R. George. She references the editor, Marco Palmieri, who has a great history with Star Trek, but she doesn't mention those authors that worked with her on the series. And you'd think if anyone was going to be on a mention, you'd at least get a shout out, which happens in every other joint series, where you get a shout out to the fellow authors who worked with you. And instead, they don't even get that. Instead, Heather Jarman shouts out 2 authors, Jeffrey Lang and Kirsten Beyer, both of which would later work with her on the String Theory trilogy. And that is unfortunate because it seems like she went to outside help who were Trek authors, but not the Trek authors of this series. And so it didn't feel connected like it should be. And I will also say, I would have gotten this anyway reading the book because I'm able to pick up little Easter eggs like this, but it was painfully obvious when you read about her mentioning Jeffrey Lang and Kirsten Beyer in the acknowledgments. And in the first 3 chapters, you get a character named Ambassador Lang, and you get a character named Ensign Bayer. And it was so obvious that they were just ways for her to reference and get the names of her friend authors in the book, which is fine. I don't have a problem with including friends friends in your books. In fact, I really like it when authors do that. But the problem is there was no subtlety to it. It felt in your face. And the rule of thumb generally is you don't want to include a famous name or a connection like that in your first chapter unless it's a character who's about to be killed off or something. Generally, you want it to be about between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way through the book so that the audience has bought in, they're involved in this, and then there's this walk-on character and you go, oh, is that okay? And then you keep reading. But here, because it started in the first couple of chapters, I was like, oh boy, here we go. And it took me out of the book. And it set the book off on a bad foot. Ooh, that was not well said. Anyway, but you get my point. And so there were little things like that, picks that I have that I didn't appreciate in the book. But as you can tell, those are minor nitpicks compared to the story and the themes and the characters. The characters are well developed, as always. They weren't stellar, but they weren't bad by any means. And I do think that the writing style is significantly improved over Twilight, which I also thought was an improvement over David R. George's last books that I read. So I am excited to keep reading in this series. Of course, I'm loving reading Deep Space Nine. I think Deep Space Nine is a great line of Star Trek books. I think the books are better than the show, in my opinion, because I didn't like the show, but I really like the books. So if you've read this book or any of the books in this series, let me know down in the comments section what you thought of them. If you are interested in reading this book or any Star Trek book, let me know, and I'll try to help you out as best I can. I haven't read all of them, but I've read quite a lot. So until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.